Hello there. I'm Aaron Recap. Today, let's talk about the American psychological thriller film which was produced in 1990, known as Misery. Spoilers ahead. Stay healthy and be safe. Story revolves around a famous novelist known as Paul Sheldon, who is the author of a successful Victorian romance novel, featuring a character named Misery Chastain. But as time fades, Paul starts to despise his whole-time famous novel Misery. With a great victory and hardships, he eliminates the character he loathed and he writes a manuscript for a new novel. With this he hopes that, being true to himself, his beloved readers too will admire him for the person who he really is. Sheldon stays in the Silver Creek Lodge, Colorado and finishes off his new novel successfully. He silently celebrates his achievement and packs things into the car and heads down a mountain road to reach back home to New York. Unaware, he caught up in a disastrous blizzard and his car goes off-road, causing an accident which makes him unconscious. Soon a person rescues and carries unconscious Paul to safety. Paul regains his awareness and finds himself bedridden with broken legs and a dislocated shoulder. He was saved by a former nurse named as Annie Wilkes, and she had brought Sheldon to her remote house. She informs Paul that she had already notified a doctor about his condition and informed his publisher about his whereabouts and the condition he is. Annie promises that she will soon escort Paul to the nearest hospital as soon as the storm dies down. Annie claims to be his #1 fan and admires his work with great enthusiasm. She kindly takes care of injured Paul. With a curiosity running through her veins, hesitantly she asks to read his new novel's manuscript in the baggage, which Annie previously saved with Paul. Out of gratitude, Paul let Annie read the newly written manuscript, which she accepts wholeheartedly. But little does he know that this act of gratitude he shows will come to torment him for the rest of his life. In New York, Paul's publisher finds it peculiar that Paul had checked out of Silver Creek Lodge days ago, but still had not reached out to his daughter or the publishers. Quite worried, the publisher informs the local sheriff of the town about it. Even though sheriff finds it a little suspicious, he doesn't find enough evidence to think that Paul had gone missing. Back at Annie's home, Annie feeds Paul with a huge disappointment in her face. Concerned by this fact, Paul asks about her distress. She angrily yells at Paul about the profanity in his new work, saying it lacks nobility, which caused Paul and Annie to have an argument. But she apologizes and leaves Paul alone. Days later, Annie shows Paul her pet pig, which she had named after Paul's novel Misery. But Paul shows no great enthusiasm in it and finds it quite strange and uncomfortable. At night she suddenly barges into his room with anger, yelling and shattering things, and breaking tableware, accusing Paul that he had killed Misery Chastain in the manuscript, and fumes her anger towards Paul in a very threatening way. She then reveals to Paul that nobody knows where he is or what has happened to him nor his condition, and that if she dies, Paul will die along with her. So pray that she doesn't die, and locks him in his room. The next morning, Annie forces Paul to burn his new manuscript, telling that God had given him a chance to redeem himself. Paul implies that he can't do that, but Annie threatens to burn Paul. Menaced by Annie's action, Paul burns his manuscript. The book burns and turns into ashes, while Paul sadly looks at his hard workings fade away in the burning fire. She insists him to write a new novel titled as Misery's Return, taking her as the inspiration. Paul accepts her request to write the novel, but says that he only writes in one kind of paper and insists Annie to bring the required papers. Irritated by Paul's actions, Annie locks the door and goes back to the town to get the supplies. Seizing this moment, Paul picks up a hair clip from the floor which Annie has mistakenly dropped and opens his locked door and paces around the house, finding a way to escape. He discovers a bunch of medicine which Annie has been giving him daily and steals some of it. Then he goes back to his room before Annie arrives. Even though Paul hesitates about this, he starts writing a novel to the likings of Annie. He gives life back to Misery, as he is plotting his own escape under the nose of Annie. Days passes by and Paul writes the new Misery. Soon after, Paul's car was discovered by police hidden in a pile of melting ice. Some says that Paul was eaten by an animal while he was unconscious, and some believes he is still alive. The local sheriff discovers the scratch markings of the door and insists that Paul was taken by a random person. But he too is unsure whether Paul is alive or dead. Days follows by and Paul's new misery is coming to its end, so to celebrate this he asks Annie to have dinner with him. While Annie was distracted, he tries to poison her by spiking her wine with crushed painkillers, but he fails miserably after she accidentally knocks over her glass. One late night Annie comes into Paul's room and hands over his painkillers with a rather depressed behavior. She pulls a gun from her pocket and tells that she wants to use it to end herself and Paul, as she is scared that Paul will leave her because his feet are now halfway healed. Then she walks out of the house and drives away. Snatching this opportunity, he unlocks his door and goes to the kitchen to grab a knife to keep himself safe. Paul later finds a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about Annie's past. He discovers that she was a prime suspect for the deaths of several infants, but the trial collapsed due to lack of evidence. Annie had quoted lines from his misery novels during her trial. Paul expected Annie to come to his room that night so he could injure her and run away. But Paul's expectations fail as she straight walks back to her room. Paul hides the knife under his mattress, while seeking another opportunity to injure her. That night while Paul was sleeping, Annie barges into his room and drugged him. Annie discovers that Paul had been sneaking out of his room, so she breaks his ankles with a sledgehammer to prevent him from escaping again. She also reveals that she found the knife he had been hiding, and that she confiscated it while he was unconscious. The local sheriff, Buster, who is investigating Paul's disappearance, finds Annie quite suspicious and investigate about her past. He too soon uncover about her past trials. He asks the shopkeeper where she buys her supplies, about anything sketchy in her behavior. The shopkeeper informs the sheriff that he has sold Annie considerable quantities of typing paper, so Buster pays Annie a visit. As soon as she sees a police car heading towards her home, Annie drugs Paul and hides him in the basement. Sheriff questions her about the large amount of paper purchases she has done recently, which Annie replies that she had started to write novels as a hobby, and that she was so inspired by the writing of her favorite author Paul Sheldon. While pacing the house for clues or signs of Paul, Sheriff finds Paul drugged in the basement. Annie fatally shoots Buster with a shotgun and kills him. She tells Paul that they must die together. He agrees, on the condition that he must finish the novel in order to give misery back to the world, as he conceals a can of lighter fluid in his pocket. When the manuscript is done, Paul asks for a cigarette and 2 glasses of champagne, to which Annie complies. When she returns with the champagne glasses, he sets the manuscript on fire. As Annie rushes to save it, Paul strikes her with a typewriter and they engage in a violent struggle, with Paul stuffing her mouth full of the burned novel in retaliation, and suffers a gunshot wound to the shoulder from Annie's revolver. Paul manages to subdue Annie, causing her to hit her head on the typewriter. Paul crawls out of the room, but Annie suddenly attacks him once again. He grabs a metal doorstop and viciously bashes her in the face, finally ending her. 18 months later, Paul, now working with a cane, meets his agent, Marcia, in a restaurant in New York City. The two discuss his first post-misery novel, and the agent tells him about the positive feedbacks he is receiving from his readers. Paul replies that he wrote the novel for himself as a way to help deal with the horrors of his captivity. He ironically says that his captivity has helped him in a way, making it a new path for him to grow. His agent then asks if he would consider a non-fiction book about his captivity, but Paul, who suffers psychological trauma from the experience, declines this offer. Paul then sees Annie approaching him, only to realize that he's hallucinating. In reality, the figure he sees is a waitress, who tells Paul that she is his #1 fan. Paul reverently replies, with a smirk in his face, "That's very sweet of you." So guys, what do you think about this video? Please comment down below, leave a like and subscribe, as your support helps me to grow as a channel. Thank you so much, have a lovely day.